What if a novel about a whaling expedition turned out to be one of the deepest explorations of obsession, identity, and the mystery of life? Enter Moby Dick. Hi guys, welcome back to the Beauty of Books. My name is Ben. In this channel, we explore the transformative potential of reading great works of literature. And today we're talking about Moby Dick. So Moby Dick is one of the works of literature that is most touted universally as a classic. And yet very few people have read it. It's one of the novels that, even though it was written 170 years ago, is most talked about today. And again, very few people have a deep understanding about what Moby Dick is really about. A lot of people think, well, it's a whaling book, and that seems kind of interesting, but I don't know much else. Well, this is a book that was touted by William Faulkner as a book that he wished he had written, and T.H. Lawrence said that it's the greatest work of literature written about the ocean. And both of those are literary giants. So you know when Faulkner and Lawrence are saying that they wish they wrote these books, that these books are amazing, that this is a real work of literature. But let's not take their word for it. What is great about Moby Dick? Well, I could tell you that it has amazing symbology. The language used is incredibly rich. It has immense thematic depth. It's influenced us until today, and that deep influence continues on and will continue on into the future. I could tell you that it's interesting and that it's a cautionary tale about the extension of obsession and how it can rot somebody, how it can destroy somebody on the inside. I think the real reason why Moby Dick is a fantastic novel, though, is because it contains infinite depth. Certain novels you can read once, some novels you can read twice. There are a few novels that you can read multiple times and get more out of it every time you read it. But a novel that you can continue to read all throughout your life, you can come back to, you could read passages from it, you could read paragraphs even, and get something new every time. That is a special novel. And that's exactly what Herman Melville managed to accomplish when he wrote Moby Dick. Now, Herman Melville has other works of literature that are interesting and transformative and worth reading, but Moby Dick really stands alone. The great literary critic Harold Bloom touts this as one of the greatest works of sublime literature ever written. Now, what is the sublime? The sublime is the sense of awe when confronted with the vastness of the universe. So sublimity in literature generally takes the form of looking at great expanses. The ocean is one of the great metaphors for sublimity in literature, and in particular, Moby Dick really understands how to, or Herman Melville really understands in the work Moby Dick, how to use the ocean as a metaphor for the great power of nature. Now, there are fundamental literary conflicts, right? There's man versus man. That's a very common one. There's man versus self. It's internal. This is very, very common in the modern era. There's um, man versus nature. And that is what this book really focuses on. It's one of the great works of man versus nature. And that's because Herman Melville makes one of the great forces of nature in the character of Moby Dick. Moby Dick is a whale. Okay. Now, Moby Dick is actually based on a real whale in the early 1800s. There was a male named a famous albino whale off the coast of Chile that was known for destroying ships, and the whale's name was Moby-Dick. Now, probably Herman Melville just changed it to Moby for literary purposes, but it's interesting that the title of the book is actually based on a real whale that really was quite a fearsome whale in that part of the world at that time. Now, in the story of Moby Dick, it's interesting because it's not particularly plot heavy. It's really a collection of moments. It's man versus nature, but it's also man versus self in an interesting way. There's a lot of philosophizing going. There's a lot of questioning of the mysteries of the universe, of God, of nature, of all the classic philosophical questions. And there are certain critics that read Moby Dick and don't actually like it that much because I've heard people say, and I disagree with this assessment, but I understand where it comes from, that it would be a really great 150-page novel that is spread out over more than 500 pages and that it really should be condensed. But in a similar way to a lot of other great long works of literature like War and Peace, and Anna Karenina and Les Miserables, the philosophizing is kind of the point. It's really important in order for us to really get to the sense of what Melville is trying to say. And that's why, again, this novel has so much infinite depth because you can keep reading it and there's philosophy in it. And not all the philosophy is necessarily super germane, super specific to what's going on in the story, but it is in the sense that this collection of moments theme, it allows this feeling of stream of consciousness. Now you have to remember another thing about Moby Dick is that this book was written in the high era of Romanticism. So it's very interesting that the book feels so modern. And I think the reason that it feels so modern is because this stream of consciousness, this experimentalism, a lot of this stuff was not so common during the era of Romanticism. But it was also a book that is quite cynical in its view of human nature and humanity's fight against nature. And that is something I think that is very modern as well. During that era, when it was written, there was this sense of manifest destiny, that man is going to triumph over nature. And Moby Dick kind of threw a wrench into that a little bit. It wasn't particularly well received at the time and understood necessarily by it was afterwards, decades later, really received well. But during the time when it was first written, there was this sense, it's the height of the British Empire, America's on the rise. We are winning. We're conquering the world. The natural world is going to be under our dominion anytime soon. And I think Moby Dick's a very interesting exploration of themes like environmental destruction, industrialization, and even things like multiculturalism. There's an amazing character named Queequeg, a descendant of noble Polynesian stock. He comes from like the descendant of kings in Polynesia. And he has a very different perspective of the world. Other characters that are on this whaling expedition also have different perspectives. And for the time that it was written, it's really quite remarkable that Moby Dick was able to show so many different insights into different parts of the world. Now, there's a lot of other interesting things about Moby Dick. In order to dig deeper, we got to start by looking at some of the characters. So I mentioned Queequeg, but the most important two characters in the book are the narrator, Ishmael, and famous Captain Ahab. Now, an interesting thing about the names is these are obviously biblically inspired. So for those of you who are familiar with the stories, forgive me for briefly talking about them. But the case of Ahab, Ahab was a wicked king in Israel. He was a king that reigned along with his wife, who was also wicked, Jezebel. And he basically brought idol worship back into Israel under the worship of Baal. Now, the most famous moment in the Hebrew Bible is when the prophet Elijah goes to Mount Carmel and puts his offering on the stack of wood, and his offering, even though he covered it in water, it burns, and the offering of the worshipers of Baal doesn't, to show the power of the true God and that there's no power in the idol worship. Now, this is a really interesting reference because King Ahab was obviously a very wicked man in the Bible, and Ahab in this novel is also not a great man. He is not wicked as a king. He's not exactly parallel in that respect, but he's driven by this mad obsession. Earlier, he lost his leg on a whaling expedition, fighting this great whale, Moby Dick. And he's driven by this undying vengeance, this thirst for vengeance, essentially, to get Moby Dick. Now, everyone that joins this crew, the ill-fated crew, they don't really know how mad his obsession is. And so in a way, he is worshiping, if you will, his own desire for vengeance. And I won't spoil anything, but the costs of him doing that is he doesn't care about anyone else's life. He doesn't care about even his own life to a certain extent. All he cares about is the destruction of his enemy, which is Moby Dick. Now, the other important character is the narrator. And this book famously begins with the line, "Call me Ishmael," which is a super famous opening line. Ishmael is another biblical character from an earlier story with Abraham. So Abraham's Uh, his first son, his illegitimate son, Ishmael, was exiled from his house, and Ishmael lived in the desert in the wilderness with his mother, and was protected by the providence of God, and eventually at the end came together again with Isaac to bury Abraham when Abraham died. So there is a unification at the end, but for most of his life, Ishmael is struggling with identity. Who is he? What is his purpose? Is he a son of Abraham? Is he not a son of Abraham? And it's a really important question. And Ishmael in Moby-Dick is also struggling with identity. He doesn't know who he is. He's wandering. And he's the narrator, right? He's the narrator of this story. He's a bit unreliable too, which is another really interesting thing because unreliable narration wasn't so common back then, whereas now it's a common literary trope. So you have to really, in order to understand Moby Dick, you got to understand the Hebrew Bible, right? There's so many references there. You also have to understand other writers like William Shakespeare. There's many references to William Shakespeare all throughout. Um, in many ways, Moby Dick is striving to be Shakespearean in terms of its striving for the sublime, and I think it largely succeeds. There's also tons of references to the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle, and so you kind of got to understand a lot of a lot in order to really see where all these references are coming from. There's constant allusions, constant, symbolism, thematic depth, literary depth that makes it a bit inaccessible. And so the question is, in this modern world, in 2026, why are so many people talking about this kind of dense, inaccessible, sublime novel that is talking a lot about all these ancient references that people haven't read Moby Dick, but reading even the Bible or Shakespeare, how many of us actually take the time and read all of these works? And are we going to get all the references? Is that going to influence our ability to really make sense of this work and really understand what's being said? And I think the truth is that this is a difficult work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not something that is just, you're going to pick up and read and be like, yeah, I got it. Because it's not really a story with a plot. It's a story that is a collection of moments, right? And each of these moments is a philosophical moment. It's a sense of digging into some eternal question. And so it does require understanding of Shakespeare and understanding of the Bible. But that's why we read great works. We read them so that we have a better understanding of the world. Because greatness leaves clues, and other great writers then reference the other great works. And I'm not saying that there aren't any works that can be read completely in isolation, because there are many, absolutely. But the entire literary canon that we explore is very much built on other great works. And so understanding those earlier works could really help us dig deeper when we try to read a book like Moby Dick. Now, Moby Dick, one of the big questions that comes up is it the great American novel? So that's an interesting question. It's not just a story, it's definitely trying to capture something bigger, right? The mystery of life. And maybe that is the definition we could use for the great American novel. Does it sufficiently cope with the vicissitudes and ups and downs of life and give us a system that makes sense of everything? But I actually think the reason we read literature is not to find a system of truth. I think that's what philosophy does. If you want to understand truth as system, then you read Western philosophical books predominantly. But truth can also come as story. And this is a great insight that was actually given in a book by the late great Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks when he talked about how truth as story is something that really makes the Hebrew Bible special. Now, obviously, I mentioned before, Moby Dick is deeply influenced by that work, and so it also has an influence in that respect. It seems to tell truth as story. It's not telling you didactically, this is what is the case, this is what isn't the case. It's telling stories, constant stories, moments of stories that make you think and make you question. And that makes you a better person, which is part of the reason why I believe everybody should read Moby Dick. Now, when I say Moby Dick, why should you read Moby Dick? I think the main reason, you could say there's lots of interesting literary devices, that there's lots of stuff going on in the novel that makes it worth reading. The interesting, all the stuff we've talked about, really. But the real reason that you should read Moby Dick, again, is because it helps you to see yourself more clearly. A great work of literature shows characters at their best and at their worst. In particular, you could take the Ahab and his obsession. It's something that is destructive to everyone around him. But we know that. In our own lives, how many of us have had obsessions that have become damaging or started to rot? And that's just one component. Learning about Ahab's obsession and seeing how the little moments of how his obsession affects his life, it helps us to see ourselves more clearly, kind of like a mirror to some of the things we are obsessed with. Now, Moby Dick is very much a modern feeling novel. People say a lot of times that this was written 170 years ago. Why is it talked about so much today? And part of the reason is because despite all these old illusions, despite, you know, all of these classical needs to understand the Bible, to understand Shakespeare, to understand Thomas Carlyle, to understand the time at which it was written. Okay, let's put that aside for a second. Moby Dick was also very predictive of the modern era. In addition to, some of the interesting things we talked about earlier, it's a bit cynical in the romantic age, and that is almost modern. It's really experimental. Almost has this internet-like feeling with how encyclopedic all this different information is, and it's going from here. It's like drinking through a fire hose when it comes to information at certain points. It also feels strikingly modern, and I think I think that great works always feel modern because whenever you read them, you're reading them through the lens of the time that you're living. And a, a work of literature that is a product of its time is typically does well in that time and then it's forgotten. A work of literature that continues to have staying power is because there are deeper things that are explored. Now, the last thing I'll say here on Moby Dick is, again, I recommend reading this book. It's a great work of literature. It helps you to see the world more deeply, but it is not an easy work. It's not something that I recommend to read lightly. Read it slowly, take your time, look things up if you need to, but try. Moby Dick is a fantastic work. It is a strikingly modern work. It is something that has influenced me, and I hope that it will influence you as well. Um, this was a little bit of a ramble, so I appreciate everyone who stayed to the end, and I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed and that you will join me in future videos as we explore other works of literature, as we explore the beauty of great books and how they can influence your life, make it more meaningful, and make you a better person. Thank you guys.